All right, let's focus on these red blood cells, also called your erythrocytes. Okay, so we'll look at the structure of it and the function, looking at hemoglobin on the inside, different measurements that you'll read, like, for example, looking at a person's health, and then looking at their life cycles because they do not live forever. So, functions of our erythrocytes, looking at number 7. So, 2 principal functions: carry oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide. That's pretty much what only thing that it actually does. So, we'll talk about our hemoglobin later, but our oxygen binds a lot to the hemoglobin. It also is just in the plasma and just in the cells sometimes as well. It could also carry carbon dioxide also on that hemoglobin, but at a different section of the hemoglobin, so it's not competing with oxygen. And so helping to bring all that back to the lungs so you can exhale out, pick up more oxygen. Okay, so shape of our erythrocytes. They are disc-shaped, so kind of a flat, like a frisbee. That just helps so there's not much of a distance to get to the inside middle of the cell. So if they're flat, then there's not much distance from the outside of the cell towards the middle portion, and therefore all the hemoglobin can easily hook up with some oxygen or easily hook up with some carbon dioxide. So because of their disc shape, so basically you got to empty out the cell. So get rid of a bunch of stuff you don't need. So you lose nearly all of your organelles during development. No nucleus, no mitochondria, no Golgi, none of these normal cell function stuff. So basically your erythrocytes are just gas carriers. Okay, so without our organelles, so looking at number 8, due to the loss of mitochondria and nucleus, erythrocytes cannot do what? So no mitochondria, no production of ATP. So in order to make ATP, they have to use anaerobic fermentation in order to do that. Without a nucleus, without DNA, without those ribosomes, can't make proteins, also can't go through mitosis, which again, this is why our formed elements in an adult are made in the red bone marrow. So it's looking at the structure again and again. So it's like on the top, round, but if you look from the side, it is a flat disc type of shape. Okay, so on our surface of our blood, and this is where we're going into our next question, how is blood type determined? So on the surface of these cells, so we talked about this earlier, roughly chapter 3, dealing with what's called the glycocalyx. So this is on the surface of our cells. We have different proteins, and they are markers, for example, telling the cell, this cell belongs to this body. And therefore, that marker makes sure, unless you have an autoimmune disease, make sure that your immune system doesn't attack that cell. They also have a bunch of proteins on the inside that helps to make them all bendy and stuff. So they're flexible. So as they're going through like really tiny passages, they can bend and flex and move. But blood type, we're going to focus on the outside surface. Darn it, that's not there yet. Okay, we'll get to that. Okay, so gas transport. So again, inside of the cell, therefore they have an increased surface area to volume ratio. So again, the flat disc, it helps it easy to move your gas in and out the cell. Bunch of the cell, most of it is hemoglobin. So again, just binding for your oxygen and carbon dioxide. There is a reaction. I kind of mentioned it earlier in AP1. We will talk about this reaction in exam 6. Exam 7, exam 8, and possibly exam 9. I'm not sure. I can't really exactly remember, but I know definitely exam 6, 7, and 8 will all have that reaction of what happens to carbon dioxide when you combine it with water. So we'll talk about that somewhere. Okay, so hemoglobin, again, that's where our oxygen and carbon dioxide can bind to. So the oxygen binds to the ferrous iron portion, so our little red portions here, those prosthetic groups. The carbon dioxide can bind to different proteins, including the proteins on hemoglobin. So that's where it binds. So they don't actually compete against each other. And I probably knocked out all of this stuff because I just probably pushed it to the respiratory system, and that's why that's not on the study guide. Blood type. Well, shucks. Oh, okay, that's probably why. Okay, so how does hemoglobin transport oxygen and carbon dioxide? So we'll come back to 9. So oxygen on the heme groups, carbon dioxide on the globin protein portion. So totally different spots for them. Where is hemoglobin produced? Okay, so we talked about this earlier. Red blood cells, they have absolutely no ability to make protein. So how do we get hemoglobin, which is a protein, inside our red blood cells? So with our hemoglobin, which that's one thing you actually can measure as you're doing a hematocrit. So as your changes in hemoglobin levels are, if you have a good hemoglobin level, you should be able to carry a good enough oxygen. If that level drops, you're not going to be able to carry oxygen as well, and so that's a bad thing. Same thing, red blood cell count. That's another way of looking at how much oxygen you can actually carry. I'm going to skip that. Okay, so looking at our red blood cell production. So this is where we actually are able to make hemoglobin before we just start dumping out organelles that we don't need anymore. So the fancy word for that is erythropoiesis. So it takes about 3 to 5 days to get another, to actually get a new red blood cell. So it starts off with a kind of like stem cell situation. It reduces in size. You do a little bit of multiplying. You make your hemoglobin. So we're going to talk about that. And then you lose organelles that you don't need because you don't care. You don't need it. You're just carrying oxygen. That's the job of it. Okay, so I'm not making you know all the steps because I could care less. So there is multiple steps that goes through it. Again, it's kind of like a stem cell situation. There is one level where you're eventually going to be your erythrocyte cell, so your regular red blood cell. At one stage, they're called the erythroblast. So they still have the nucleus, they still have your ribosomes, and so therefore they can make proteins, which is where your hemoglobin is made. So answer for, which number is that? Number 11. Where is it produced? In the erythroblast. Oops. Come back. Okay. And then eventually the nucleus is discarded. Some of your red blood cells are called a reticulocyte, so it still has your endoplasmic reticulum. So, not all of them actually dump out everything. So here is our little steps again. I could care less about you knowing almost any of this except for erythroblast. That's where hemoglobin is produced. Eventually you dump out everything and you get your mature red blood cell, also called your erythrocyte. Without it, can't go through mitosis, can't make ATP, can't make proteins because it doesn't have the organelles to do it. Okay. Hemoglobin, iron. Okay. Okay, so in order for our body to bind oxygen to hemoglobin, we have to have the iron prosthetic group onto hemoglobin. So we have to have iron into our body. So how do we get it? So, course part through our diet. So as we eat, if there's iron in what we've eaten, so dark green leafy vegetables, meat from animals who've eaten said dark green leafy vegetables, our stomach acid, we'll talk about this later, it actually converts our iron that's been ingested, so the external source of iron being our diet, stomach acid converts it into an absorbable form. That form of iron is then bind to a protein. I could care less about you knowing about the proteins. Bound to those proteins, absorbed into your bloodstream, transferred to another protein. Those proteins take it to the liver, so our liver can store it. So that's why liver is such a dark color, because it stores iron, and so that gives it that darkness. Okay, so external source of iron is our diet. We'll talk about, okay, number 14, what organ is the storage site for for iron? That's your liver. Okay, so molecules that need iron. So again, we have to take in iron because we do lose some of it throughout the day. We do have other vitamins. We'll talk about them in the digestion system chapter, but we do need some vitamins in very small amounts, but they also help with our body functions. Okay, we'll talk about that later then, I guess. Okay. Give me a second. Molecules. Okay. Okay, so in our production of our red blood cells, so our erythropoiesis, it is a negative feedback. So going back to chapter 2 or 1, something to that effect, talking about a negative feedback. So we have a change in something, and our job for the body, it wants to reverse that change. So we have a drop in red blood cells. We want to reverse that change. So that is detected by our kidneys. So we'll talk about this in the exam 9 section about the kidneys and how they function. And part of how they function is they continuously filter the blood to make urine. So they're going to sense that, hey, we don't have enough red blood cells. So it's going to produce a hormone called erythropoietin to stimulate the bone marrow in order to stimulate red blood cell production. So other stimuli for increasing red blood cells, low oxygen levels. So if your tissues aren't getting what they need, we make more carriers. High altitude, which really basically is another low oxygen situation since the air is thinner there, not able to have as much oxygen. Increase in exercise. So you exercise more, your tissues need more oxygen, so we need more carriers for that oxygen. And then lastly, loss of lung tissue could be because you had surgery, could be because you had emphysema, could be because you had COVID and your lung cells become damaged. So instead of having a bunch of surface area in the lungs, you have a lot less, and that's why those people were like gasping for breath and having a hard time because their lungs have gotten damaged. They have less surface area for gas exchange, and so hopefully their body's able to respond and create more red blood cells to at least help to carry more oxygen, so possibly help them out with their breathing. Okay, let's move on. So there's your little negative feedback loop. So again, you can also sense your level of red blood cells in your liver, again, because part of our digestive system, all of the blood from our digestive system goes to your liver. And that's another job that the liver does. It stores a lot of our nutrients. So these two organs can sense that change, secrete out erythropoietin to our red bone marrow. Again, red bone marrow making all 7 of our formed elements. And that stimulates our red blood cell production, therefore increasing our red blood cell levels. Okay, eventually they die. So they circulate around. They get beat up. They're exchanging stuff. They're going through these tiny little, very small blood vessels. Eventually they get a little weak. So in some of our organs, particularly ones that have very small blood vessels, they can rupture. That's called hemolysis. So lysis, to break something up. So when they break up, then they're basically cell debris. So how do we get rid of it? This goes a little bit into our immune system stuff, but oh well. So we have these certain cells called macrophages. They are a diversified, so specialized group of our white blood cells, and their job is to eat stuff. So that's this whole category. That's all they do. So foreign cell, we eat it. Cellular debris, we eat it. So that's all that they do, and they help to get rid of stuff that we don't need. So they're going to help to break it up, take the heme away from the globin, because we're going to reuse that. The globin protein can be broken down, so we can reuse those amino acid building blocks, and then reuse the iron or possibly lose it. So we don't waste anything when it comes to our red blood cells. Now, what do we do with that heme once it's done? So we break down the heme. So of course you look at your blood is a nice bright red color, and that is the form of heme. And then it gets converted through different organs to eventually break down into your urine and poop color. So your urine is yellow because of the breaking down of your heme. Your poop is brown because of the breaking down of the heme. So, yeah, that's just what those colors are. If your color is anything else, it could be a medicine. Sometimes they throw off stuff like, just learned recently that Pepto-Bismol can actually make your poop a very, very dark color. Interesting. Anyway, okay, let's move on. Okay, so this is just talking about your red blood cells, their whole life. So we get the nutrients that we need from our small intestines, because that's where most of our digestion and nutrient absorption occurs. We take it the appropriate tissue, so our red bone marrow. Red bone marrow makes our blood cells. Those blood cells circulate throughout our circulatory system, eventually die off, get broken up in the spleen, and then just get broken up into their different pieces. Some stuff gets reused, some stuff just getting degraded. Okay, keep going. Okay, blood type. So technically this goes back into... Oops, going back. Okay, so our earlier question about our blood types focused just generically on the glycoproteins. The next section, we're actually going to go into detail, which is going to be a different video, just so it's not too long, because that is a significantly long section, especially because we are learning a bunch of new vocabulary. So, double check. Phone, open up, hurry up, let's go. Okay, the question about what molecules in the body use iron, number 13. Okay, so those would be these here. So again, we have our hemoglobin, so that's where our oxygen binds to. We have the muscle version of hemoglobin, which is myoglobin. And then later when we talk about our digestive system, we'll deal with different coenzymes that help with our production of ATP. And those are called cytochromes. Those cytochromes also use iron as part of their structure. So, next video, we are going to start with our our different blood types and how we actually mark that. Okay, see you next time.